The old man hadn't taught anyone in 4 years. This was not a secret, it was simply a fact that moved through the Hong Kong martial arts community the way important facts move through close communities, quietly, without announcement, carried from person to person by people who understood what it meant and were careful about how they passed it on. Master Liang Wei-Chen had trained students for 41 years. He had produced practitioners whose names were known in every serious school in the region. And then, in the autumn of 1963, he had stopped. No explanation had been given that anyone had been willing to share publicly. The school remained open. He still appeared each morning, but the teaching had stopped, and the students he had were the last ones he intended to have. Bruce Lee heard about him in the winter of 1966. He heard about him in the specific way that Bruce Lee heard about most things that mattered to him, not through formal channels, not through introductions arranged by people who wanted to facilitate a meeting, but through the accumulated conversations of someone who spent a great deal of time with practitioners who were serious about their work and who had learned, over years, that the most significant information about what was actually possible in a discipline tended to live in the quieter parts of the conversations rather than the announced ones. What he heard was this: that Liang Wei-Chen was 90 years old, had practiced Tai Chi for 73 years, and had developed, over those 73 years, a quality of rootedness that nobody who had encountered it had been able to adequately describe to anyone who hadn't. People tried. The descriptions were always insufficient. The best one Bruce Lee encountered, offered by a practitioner in his 50s who had worked with Liang 15 years earlier, was simply, "It is like trying to move a mountain that has decided not to be moved." Bruce Lee spent 2 months arranging a meeting. The arrangement required patience of a specific kind, not the patience of waiting for something to happen, but the patience of understanding that the path to a particular outcome was indirect, and that moving directly toward it would close it rather than open it. Liang had declined every formal introduction attempt made to him in the previous 3 years. He was not reclusive in any dramatic sense. He walked the same routes each morning, ate at the same tea house, maintained the same quiet daily structure he had kept for decades. He simply wasn't interested in being met by people who wanted something from him. Bruce Lee approached it differently. He began attending the tea house, not to encounter Liang, to be there. He arrived at the same hour each morning, sat at the same table, ordered the same tea, and was present in the specific, unhurried way of someone who has nowhere else to be. He did this for 3 weeks without making any approach. On the 22nd morning, Liang sat down at the adjacent table. He did not introduce himself. He did not acknowledge that any arrangement had been made or that the younger man had been working toward this meeting for months. He simply sat, ordered his tea, and was present in the same way the younger man had been present, and the 2 men sat in adjacent silence for 40 minutes before either of them said anything. What was said first, when it came, was not about martial arts, it was about tea, specifically about the particular quality of the tea at that house, whether it was better in the morning or the afternoon, and what the difference was. It was a conversation that could have been had by any 2 people at adjacent tables in any tea house in Hong Kong. It was also, for both of them, precisely the right conversation to be having. Liang said, eventually, that the younger man had been here for some weeks. Bruce Lee said yes. Liang asked why. Bruce Lee said he liked the tea. Liang looked at him for a moment with the specific, unhurried attention of a man who has spent 90 years learning to read the difference between what people say and what they mean, and who no longer finds the gap between the two particularly interesting to investigate.
He said, "Come on Thursday."
He did not specify where or at what time or for what purpose. He stood, paid for his tea, and left. Bruce Lee arrived at Liang's school at 6 in the morning on Thursday. What happened over the following 3 days was not a formal lesson. Liang never framed it as instruction, never offered explanations, never used the language of teaching at all. He simply moved, or more precisely, he stood, and Bruce Lee attempted to move him. And the standing and the attempting occupied the 3 days in a way that was, for Bruce Lee, the most comprehensively humbling experience of a martial arts life that had not been short on challenges. The first morning, Bruce Lee approached the problem the way he approached every physical problem, with the full application of what he knew, which was, by any reasonable measure, considerably more than most people who had ever stood in front of a 90-year-old man trying to move him. He had the technical knowledge, the physical conditioning, the specific quality of perceptual training that had taken him years to develop. He applied all of it in different combinations and from different angles for 3 hours. Liang did not move. Not a step, not a shift of weight, not a single adjustment of position in response to anything Bruce Lee did. He stood in the specific way of someone who has been standing in this particular relationship with gravity for 73 years and finds the current situation entirely unremarkable. Bruce Lee left that evening with the specific, valuable feeling of having encountered something genuine. The second day, he tried something different. He had spent the previous evening thinking not about technique, but about principle, about the quality of immovability that he had encountered actually consisted of and what the response to it needed to be. Not more force, because force was what the first day had established was insufficient. Not more speed, because speed was a response to a problem and he wasn't yet certain he had identified the correct problem. He arrived on the second morning with a different quality of attention. Liang noticed. Bruce Lee could tell he noticed, not from any change in the old man's expression or posture, but from the quality of his stillness, which deepened slightly, in the same way that a conversation deepens when both people understand that the exchange has moved to a more interesting level. The second day lasted 4 hours. At the end of it, Bruce Lee had not moved Liang, but he had come once within a fraction of a shift, a moment where he had found, briefly, the specific quality of contact that seemed to reach something real rather than simply pressing against the surface of the immovability. The moment lasted perhaps a second before Liang adjusted, and the adjustment was so small as to be almost invisible, but it was there. It was enough. It told Bruce Lee that the problem had a solution. He left the second evening with something he hadn't had at the end of the first, a direction. The third day, he was closest. He could feel the shape of what he was working toward more clearly, the specific, almost geometric quality of the principle that produced the rootedness, and the corresponding principle that would, if he could find it, engage it rather than resist it. He worked at it for 5 hours, getting closer in a way that was measurable only to himself, finding the edges of the approach without quite reaching the center of it. At the end of the third day, Liang looked at him. He said, "Come back tomorrow." Bruce Lee arrived on the fourth morning having slept badly and having spent most of the night in the specific restless thinking of someone who is trying to locate something in their own understanding that they can feel the outline of but can't quite reach. He arrived at 6. He sat with Liang in the tea corner of the school for a few minutes before they began. He said something. It was not a question, it was not a declaration, it was an observation, brief, specific, about the quality of what he had been working toward over the previous 3 days and where he thought he had been misunderstanding it. One sentence, the kind of sentence that could only have been spoken by someone who had spent 3 days failing in a very specific way and had, in that failure, arrived at an understanding that 3 days of success would not have produced. Liang listened to the sentence.
Then he did something that the few people in his remaining orbit said they had not seen him do in years. He laughed. Not the polite social laugh of an old man being kind to a younger one. A real laugh, the specific, delighted laugh of someone who has been holding a question for a long time and has just heard it answered by someone they hadn't expected to answer it. He said, "Yes." One word, but it was said with the full weight of 73 years of practice behind it, and Bruce Lee felt it arriving his body before it arrived in his mind. What happened next was not dramatic in any external sense. Liang stood up and showed him, not a technique, a principle, the underlying structural idea that everything Bruce Lee had been pressing against for 3 days had been built on. He showed it the way a very old teacher shows something to someone who has already found the edge of it themselves, not from the beginning, but from the place the student has reached.
It took 40 minutes. Bruce Lee left the school that afternoon carrying something he had not arrived with 4 days earlier. Not a technique, not a skill, something more fundamental, a reorganization of how he understood the relationship between stillness and force, between rootedness and movement, between the quality of presence in a body that was not trying to impose anything and the quality of presence in a body that was trying to impose everything. He incorporated what he had learned into the work he was already doing. The people who trained with him in the months that followed said something had changed, not dramatically, not in any single obvious technique, but in the underlying quality of his movement, the way his weight settled, the specific stability that appeared in his body in the moments when an opponent expected instability. Several of them asked him about it. He said he had met an old man who had showed him something. He did not say more than that. He did not need to. Master Liang continued his quiet daily life in Hong Kong. He trained no more students. He died in 1971 at 94 years old, having spent 77 years in daily practice of his art. Among his papers found afterward was a single page of notes from 1967, the year of the 4 visits. The notes were brief and in his particular, compressed form of calligraphy. They described in a few lines an encounter with a young man who had come to try to move him and had spent 3 days failing. He wrote that on the 4th day, the young man had said something that demonstrated he had understood from the failure what most students never understood from success. He wrote that the young man had the quality he had been looking for in students for a long time and had decided did not exist in sufficient abundance to justify continuing to teach. He wrote that he had been wrong about that. He did not write the young man's name. He did not need to. If this story reminded you that the most important lessons arrive through failure that is paid attention to, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. Subscribe for more stories about the man behind the legend. Because Bruce Lee spent 3 days failing to move a 90-year-old man and walked away with more than any victory would have given him. There is a specific kind of knowledge that only failure produces, not the failure of insufficient effort, not the failure of wrong approach, but the failure of someone who has brought everything they have to a problem and discovered that everything they have is not sufficient. This is a different kind of failure from the ordinary kind. It is, in its own way, a gift, the specific gift of having the true boundary of one's current capability made fully visible, without the consolation of having held anything back. Bruce Lee had spent his entire martial arts life moving toward the edges of his own capability. This was not a rhetorical commitment, but a practical one. He had built his training, his philosophy, and his system around the idea that the edge was the only place where genuine learning happened, and that the practitioner who stayed comfortably within their established capability was not practicing, but performing. The 4 days with Liang had shown him an edge he had not previously known existed. Not the edge of his speed or his strength or his technical knowledge. Those were edges he had been working at for years and knew the shape of. The edge that the 4 days revealed was something more foundational, the edge of his understanding of what the body's relationship with gravity actually was at its deepest level, and what became possible when that relationship was fully, completely settled. He had felt it briefly in the first moment of the fourth morning conversation before Liang had said yes. He had felt the sentence he was about to say arrive in his body before he said it, arrive not as an idea, but as a physical understanding, something that had organized itself overnight out of 3 days of careful, attentive failure, and had presented itself complete in the quiet of the school's tea corner. That was the moment he had understood. Not what Liang had been showing him, he had understood that intellectually by the end of the 3rd day. What he understood in that morning moment was why it had taken 3 days of failure to understand it, why intellectual understanding had been available from relatively early in the process and had been entirely insufficient. The knowledge lived in the body, not the mind. It could not be given, it could only be arrived at, through the accumulated physical information of trying and failing and trying again until the body itself found the shape of the thing the mind had been circling. The 40 minutes that followed were Liang giving him the language for something his body had already, in those 3 days, begun to learn. He carried it with him for the rest of his life, not as a technique he could demonstrate, not as a principle he could articulate in any form that would transfer the actual thing rather than a description of the actual thing. He carried it as a quality, available in his movement, visible to serious practitioners who spent time with him in the years that followed, never quite reducible to an explanation. Several people asked him over those years whether there was a teacher who had influenced him beyond what his written and recorded acknowledgments suggested. He was consistent in his answer. He said there had been someone. He did not give a name. He said only that the lesson had taken 3 days to receive and 40 minutes to be given, and that the 3 days had been the essential part. The 40 minutes, he said, would have meant nothing without the 3 days. He said that this was, in his experience, how the most important lessons arrived, requiring the student to have already, through their own effort and failure, built the place where the lesson could land.